welcome to this edition of the Jewish Cooking Connection. I'm Mary Gatter, a proud member of the JFED Players. The Players are a community theater ensemble that operates under the direction of the Jewish Federation of the Greater San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. Today I'm going to demonstrate for you how to make a quick and easy flourless chocolate cake. Because it's flourless, it's totally appropriate for Passover, and because it's quick and easy, you'll want to make this all through the year, whenever you want a dessert that's delicious, decadent, and worth every single sinful calorie. Okay, to get started, I'm going to put on my apron, because getting prepared and getting suited up is one of the most important things you can do to be successful in cooking and, in fact, in life. So now we're ready to go. First of all, I'm going to share with you my mise en place. Mise en place is a fancy French word that just means getting all your ingredients ready before you start. To start with this, we will take, first of all, to start with this, we will turn on the oven to 375 degrees. Then we'll take an 8-inch baking pan and we'll cut a round of parchment to fit in the pan. Parchment can come in large rolls like aluminum foil, but it also comes in this handy dandy pre-cut pick one up roll also from the supermarket. So I had previously cut an 8-inch roll from this. Now the directions say to grease the pan. So I'm going to start right now. I'm going to take the pan and spray the bottom of the pan and the sides of the pan. I'm going to put the parchment on there and I'm going to spray it again. Doubly sure. So I'm going to set that aside and pick it up later. All right, now that we have our mise en place in place, I'm going to discuss each of these ingredients. The first ingredient for a chocolate cake is, of course, chocolate. This recipe specifies that you can use either semi-sweet chocolate or bittersweet chocolate. I have a bit of a sweet tooth, so I tend to use semi-sweet chocolate, but for those persons who inexplicably prefer dark chocolate, they can use bittersweet. A word to the wise, however, I would experiment first with mixing half and half bittersweet and semi-sweet before you go down the bittersweet route. Now, the people who made this recipe were very nice to you because they specify 1 cup, and 1 cup is really easy to measure out. The next ingredient we'll discuss is butter. This recipe calls for 8 tablespoons of unsalted butter. Most baking recipes today do require unsalted butter, and the reason is simple. The people who create the recipes want to make sure that they control the amount of salt in the final product and not the manufacturer of the butter. So here we have 8 tablespoons, not 7.5 tablespoons of unsalted butter. Our next ingredient is sugar, white sugar. I have nothing too much to say about this ingredient except that it's really yummy, we love it, and it's really bad for us. Our next ingredient to discuss is salt. As we talked about it, the makers of this recipe wanted to define the amount of salt in the recipe. So this recipe calls for 1/4 of a tablespoon of salt. And here's a little tip. When you're pouring out the salt, do not pour it out over the bowl that you have everything else in, because the phone will ring, something will distract you, you'll overflow, and then you'll be picking salt granules out of your product. No. Put the salt in the bowl over the sink and then put it in the recipe. Now, the next thing is some espresso powder. Coffee accentuates and deepens the flavor of chocolate, so we'll put a teaspoon of that in here. Then there is vanilla. This recipe also calls for a teaspoon of vanilla. The next ingredient is eggs, 3 eggs, which we made sure to have in advance. Many recipes today call for room temperature eggs. And I have to confess, sometimes I don't use room temperature eggs. I pull them out of the refrigerator at the last moment. The reality is using colder eggs versus room temperature eggs will not make a difference to the taste of the final product. Instead, the batter will be 1 or 2 degrees chillier, and you'll just have to cook it for a minute longer. The final thing we want to talk about is cocoa powder. Okay, now we're ready to start baking. We take our bowl and we pour in our cup of chocolate chips, and we undo our butter. We're getting our fingers greasy anyway. We'll just go like this. And then I'm going to put some saran wrap over this. in the microwave on high power for 1 minute. While that's baking, or doing its thing, melting I guess, I should tell you that the recipe that you have in front of you also suggests that you can possibly put chocolate directly on the burner on low flame. I would never do that. I would never put chocolate directly over a heat source because it's going to burn. We are going to save some time by cracking the eggs. Now, again, I would suggest not cracking the eggs directly into your bowl because eggshells are going to fall into your batter and you're going to be picking them out along with the salt crystals from earlier. So now we've got the egg in a little bowl here. And we're going to take a spoon and we're going to beat them up. When this comes out of the microwave, you can kind of see that the butter is melted and the chocolate chips are still have some of their form, but they're going to melt away pretty easily. And so now comes the most fun part. We are going to take this spoon and just integrate our melted butter with our chocolate until there's no chocolate chip shape left. So the chocolate is ready now. You see there's no more chocolate chips in it. And I'm just going to start adding the ingredients one at a time. We know we have 1/4 teaspoon of salt, which I'm going to turn my back to you and do over not what I'm putting in. So there you go. And then I'm going to have a teaspoon of my espresso powder to enhance the flavor. I'm going to throw that in there. This is basically a 1.5 bowl recipe, which also makes it appealing to me. Then I'm going to take my vanilla, my expensive vanilla, and I'm going to put in a teaspoon of that, not more than a teaspoon. Voila. Okay, so that's that. And then I'm going to, stir this up just a little bit to integrate those ingredients. And then I'm going to pour in my bad for me sugar and whip that up, mix that up. This is tedious watching this happen, right? Like watching paint dry, but there you go. All right, so it's going to be a little granular, but that's totally fine. Then I'm going to pour in my eggs. All right, so that's good too. All right, now the recipe calls for it to be just combined. By just combined, it means you don't see any streaks of yellow from the eggs, you don't see any streaks of white from the sugar, it's all one amalgamated mass. And then finally, we have our cocoa. Our cocoa is over here, not Dutch processed, which I've already measured out a 1/2 cup, so I don't have to bore you by doing that on screen. I'm going to pour that right in there. And then I'm going to stir this up until the just combined happens. The cocoa tends to adhere to the sides of the bowl, so you want to be careful that the whole thing is mixed very well, but certainly not over-mixed. Over-mixing is a no-no. So we're almost there. Almost there. All right, it's looking better and better. It's looking good. No more cocoa granules on the edge. And before I finish, let's just look at the recipe and make sure we haven't left anything out. So, a cup of semi-sweet chocolate, 8 tablespoons of unsalted butter, 3/4 cup of granulated sugar, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of espresso, 1 vanilla extract, 3 eggs, cocoa powder, and that's it. All right, so our recipe is complete. Now we're going to take our pan here, move a few things out of the way, and we are going to make sure again that there's no cocoa attached to the sides. And we're going to pour this gently into this pan. All right, but I am going to straighten this out and just make sure that it's kind of evenly distributed throughout this pan. I'm going to go like this a few times, and then I'm going to put it in the oven. And I'm going to set my timer for 25 minutes. Now the 25 minutes is done, I'm going to take out this cake. As you can see, the top of the cake is a little cracked, and that's totally fine. We're going to take this cake and put it upside down on this plate, which is also fine. And if you read the recipe, you'll see that it says that the top can be cracked and the edges can be coming off, and that's all totally fine. Now, while this cake was baking, I would have made my ganache, which is here. And the ganache consists of 1 stick of butter and 1 1/4 cups of semi-sweet chocolate chips. And you want the texture and consistency of the ganache is important because you want it to be firm enough to hold up while you're frosting the cake, but yet not so drippy that it falls off the edges. You can possibly see that it's got a very elegant gloss on it. Oh, now my cake is... All right, so I'm gonna leave it down for a minute so I can get it spread all the way out here. And I have to say the cake has cooled a little bit more than it usually does. And it's creating some problems for me, but it's still gonna taste absolutely delicious. All right, so here we go. Here we go, spreading this all over the top of the cake. If the cake was not falling apart the sides, the way this particular one does, I would put the ganache around the bottom and the sides as well. But because it is falling apart, I'll just leave them all on the top. And so we're about ready to cut this cake. And when you taste it, you will be happy that you made this delicious, flourless chocolate cake. Thank you.
כל המעשים ברוך ומבורך בפי כל נשמה גדלו וטובו מלא עולם דעת ותבונה סובבים אותו המתגאה על חיות הקודש ונדע בכבוד על המרכבה זכות ומשול לפני חיסו חסד ורחמים לפני כבודו טובים מאוד שבא